Friends, it has happened. The West is stunned, and London especially. Moscow has officially terminated the agreement from 1956, the very document that British officials routinely called an element of stability or simply a perpetual free pass into the Russian fishing zone. For 70 years, Britain fished off the Russian coast as if it were a geographical misunderstanding. Well, yes. Formally, this is your waters, but we understand that this is the common heritage of the civilized world. Moscow looked at this for many years with the lazy patience of a major power. Well, yes, let them fish. Peace of mind is more valuable. But times have changed, and so has the attitude towards the eternal guests of the refrigerator. So, as always, this is your humble servant, Timofey Rudnitsky. Here, we talk about things that are rarely spoken about openly. Watch the video until the end, as this story is much broader than just a contract termination. Your support is needed more than ever. Please click like and subscribe to the channel. Well, let's get started. Russia's decision seems simple, logical, and particularly frustrating for London, extremely timely. The United Kingdom had just gotten used to the idea that sanctions are a tool for others, not a boomerang. And now history quietly knocked on the door and asked, are you sure that 7 decades of free exploitation isn't too much to remain in the privileged section? A dialogue that could be staged in the theater of the absurd. Britain indignantly asks, oh nah, how come? We've had it free for 70 years. Russia unyieldingly replies, did you think there would be an eternal buffet for you? Britain brazenly states, well, yes. Russia responds, en shams, in vain. The dialogue is short but essentially a political marker. He notes that Britain has become so accustomed to unilateral benefits that the very word termination sounds to it like an insult to centuries-old traditions. Although if you think about it, this tradition is just an ordinary Soviet concession from the thaw era, made when the world was different, the country was different, and the West did not consider international law a brochure for table decoration. But to understand the scale of Britain's surprise, one must return to where it all began. The year 1956, Khrushchev's thaw, an attempt at détente, cautious signals to the West. The USSR wants to be a convenient partner. Against this backdrop, an agreement appears allowing the United Kingdom to enter Soviet fishing areas for free, without quotas, without rent, and without restrictions. At the time, it seemed like a trifle. The country is gigantic, there is a lot of fish, and the main thing is political symbolism. And here is the paradox. The temporary measure outlasted everything. Collapsing empires, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the dissolution of the USSR, Britain's entry into the EU, Britain's exit from the EU, the sanctions of 2014, the era of the new Cold War, and even the era when London considered the phrase international law an anachronism if it did not align with its interests. For 70 years, the Russian side endured not because they liked it, but because fish was not the biggest problem in a vast economy. It was a political gesture that Britain decided to interpret as a natural phenomenon, like the Gulf Stream. Well, yes, warmth comes from the Atlantic. Well, yes, free fish comes from Russia. So what's the big deal? That's how it should be. If you look at the documents from those years, it seems that the British side didn't even hide its confidence. If there's an agreement, then it's forever. Sounds comical. While the world was dividing spheres of influence, dismantling colonies and making fateful decisions, British trawlers were diligently pulling cod from Soviet waters for free, confidently, with an expression that said, that's how it should be. British historians today are trying to explain. It was a mechanism of stability, an element of trust, a symbol of bilateral relations. And if we set aside the lyrical aspect, it was an unlimited subscription, not issued by mistake, but in an era when the USSR viewed such gifts as an investment in the future. But the future they envisioned back then no longer exists. In the 2020s, Moscow changed its approach to international deals, especially those where the balance of benefits has long been disrupted. Britain, however, changed nothing and naively assumed that if it was once given a privilege, it would turn into an eternal right. As a result, when Russia closed the storeroom door, British ministers began frantically searching for the cancel update button. The problem is there is no button. There is only the reality in which London suddenly found itself without the usual fish rent. And here arises a new ironic situation. Britain is agitated, as if Moscow turned off its electricity. Although in reality it's about a simple fact, it's somehow inappropriate to hold a free buffet in someone else's house for 7 decades. On the island there is currently an astonishing mood, a mix of resentment, confusion, and an attempt to not show that something serious is happening. British newspapers write, this is a blow to fishing communities, an unexpected decision by Moscow, a threat to food security, and the politicization of fishing. But the funniest part is not the texts, but the subtext. It reads like this: Russia was obliged to continue. It's a tradition. British fishermen really got used to the idea that the Russian waters are like an accessible kitchen area where you can go in and take cod, hake, or hakadish, or haddock. The habit is so ingrained in their minds that any change is perceived as a political attack. But the world has changed, and so has Moscow. And the main question is, what has London done to keep this privilege?
if you look with cold logic?
Logically, the answer is obvious. Nothing.
On the contrary, it was British politicians in recent years who declared at every turn the need for strong pressure on Russia, expanding sanctions, banning Russian ships from entering British ports, freezing Russian assets, and ending economic cooperation. And yet, in this atmosphere, Britain somehow believed that one exception would remain untouched. The very exception that gave it a strategic advantage in an entire industry. Russia did not make pompous statements, did not accompany the decision with loud symbols. It simply notified London that the Soviet concession, which lasted 7 decades, is no longer relevant. This is not an act of strength, not a response to sanctions, not a political signal, it is a restoration of normalcy. In international practice, there are no eternal unilateral advantages, free access to another country's resources, or special zones given forever. And if Britain is surprised, that is perhaps the most important consequence. When London says, "We are shocked," Moscow responds, "And we are shocked by your shock." At this point, one could put a period, but the story is just beginning. And now Britain will be looking for those to blame, devising pressure tactics, and trying to explain to its fishermen how it happened that 7 decades of free feasting ended precisely when they needed it the most.
Ironic? Yes?
Naturally. Absolutely. If you look at the chronology of the last 10 years, it becomes obvious that Moscow's decision to break the 1956 agreement was not sudden, it was the result of patience that London methodically tested and each time was surprised why it suddenly ended. The year 2014, yet the first sanctions against Russia, loud statements, diplomatic notes, and declarations like Russia must pay for everything. And yet, British imports of Russian fish continued as if nothing had happened. The year 2022, the rhetoric reaches a new level. Total blockade, complete refusal, everything Russian urgently banned. But in practice, Britain continues to take fish. The years 2023 to 2024, London vows to give up everything of Russian origin and then asks fish processors to find a replacement, but not now. The mechanism is the same. Russia is the enemy, but code is sacred. A dialogue explaining the absurdity. Russia, you impose tariffs, confiscate property, declare us an enemy, and continue to catch our fish for free. Britain, well code, that's different. And this different. What is the quintessence of the British approach, where principles are principles, but fish is a daily reality. But why is London nervous? And here are 3 facts that London would prefer not to discuss at press conferences. Up to 40% of all white fish in Britain is Russian. In 2023, 600,000 tons of Russian seafood. Simply put, Russia is not a supplier. Russia is the foundation of British gastronomic identity. Moscow said enough. January 2024. Russia signals for the first time its readiness to terminate the agreement. February-March. Legal preparations are completed. The conclusion is obvious. The agreement is outdated. The economy has changed. Politics have changed. The privilege is no longer needed. Spring 2024. The State Duma votes unanimously. Even those who always argue for any reason understand, 7 decades of one-sided concession is somewhat too much, a phrase that became a symbol. Vyacheslav Volodin said simply, and to the point, we gave them the right to fish. Now, we are taking this right back, without pathos, without threats, and with a slight hint. Did you really expect an eternal buffet or something? For 10 years, Russia watched as Britain sanctioned, blocked, accused, confiscated, and continued to use Russian resources. Now that resource is no longer available. And while Britain may be hurt but survive without oil, without fish, a national ritual is broken. Politics is politics, but fish, as it turns out, is a matter of strategic security. Britain is not in the habit of admitting its mistakes, but this time the admission comes not through ministers' statements, but through price charts that British economists show in whispers, so that housewives and restaurateurs do not hear. The disappearance of free access to Russian fish overnight turns a stable market into a deficit one. Prices will rise, and no one is hiding this anymore. A
shortage is inevitable. This is already being cautiously mentioned.
And the most painful thing is that Norway and Iceland are not going to help the ally because they plan to earn money. When the Russian resource leaves the map, the Northerners do what any market does, they raise the price. London is outraged, but this outrage is powerless. After all, fish is biology, not diplomacy. A dialogue ending that explains the whole new era. Britain. Well, maybe we can talk, like before, like friends. Russia responds coldly. In a friendly way means without sanctions. Now everything will be only after payment.
This is the central drama.
For many years, London believed that political hostility and economic privileges could go hand in hand, that it was possible to simultaneously declare Russia as the #1 threat and freely use its waters. But the era ended quietly, without loud bangs and with just one legal line. The 1956 treaty was terminated. This step is much more than a dispute over fish. It is a turning point and a break from the old code of international relations. Russia is ending the regime of unilateral concessions for the sake of good manners. Britain is facing the consequences of its own sanctions for the first time, not virtual but tangible on a plate with fish. London, which always considered itself a strategist, suddenly finds itself a hostage to its own menu and arrogance. Moscow's decision is a signal to the entire Western architecture. The rules invented during the Cold War era no longer work. Russia is revising old treaties and will continue to do so. The Arctic is closing not only legally but also politically. The EU is in a stupor. It was used to thinking that Russia is a resource and the West is an arbiter. Now the balance is different. The resource sets the rules itself, and it is London, claiming global wisdom, that gets hit first. For 7 decades, Britain fished in the Barents Sea, and now it tries to catch luck in the fog of its own sanctions. When the free feast ends, the guest usually thanks the host, but the British guest decided to slam the door. Now he will have to knock. And the main thing is, it's not about fish, it's about Russia growing up, about the era of free miracles ending both in the Barents Sea and in the European economy and in world politics. As always, this was your humble servant Timofey Rudnitsky. The world doesn't sleep and neither do I. See you in the next video. See you soon.